inspiration initially came from reading Walter Starkey's The Road to Santiago. David decided to recreate the medieval Camino, basically as it was staged in the Codex Calixtinus' Pilgrims Guide, leading groups of students in 1974, 1979, 1987, 1993, and 1996. You just met the oldest pilgrim in this room, who is Lynn Talbott, who she walked with David in 1974. I walked in 1979. Linda Davidson was also a member of the 1974 group and of all the subsequent groups as she became David's partner in life, and she also became my co-author in several books. I'd like to add that my interest was first kindled by James Michener's Iberia, published in 1968, which I read when I was in a Spanish class in high school. I could not believe my good fortune when David showed up at UNL as my Spanish professor in 1976. But I digress, so let's get back to the original topic. The Camino before the Codex Calixtinus. Who kindled the Camino spirit? Why do we even walk to Santiago de Compostela? What is the source for the many stories, myths, legends, and folk tales that are passed down from pilgrim to pilgrim? When, what, and who started this whole crazy pilgrimage idea? For those who do not know, the Codex Calixtinus, also known as the Liber Sancti Jacobi, or simply the Jacobus, is the Bible of the medieval pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. It's a 12th century manuscript collection of 5 separate books, plus an important addendum of music, some of the first polyphonic music ever written. And it also contains other disparate items relating to St. James. The name Codex Calixtinus, strictly speaking, refers only to the manuscript housed in the archives of Compostela Cathedral. It is the oldest and most complete text that we have, and is the basis for the later copies. This copy, the Codex Calixtinus itself, was written no earlier than 1130-ish, and no later than 1172, when we have evidence of the Ripoll, Catalunya copy being made from it. Despite being named after Pope Calixtus II, who was originally known as Guy of Burgundy, there is no indication that he was directly involved in its production, other than his general meddling in the religious politics of the Cluny Monastery with its multiple connections to Diego Gelmírez, Santiago's archbishop and greatest champion. Again, a digression. I must give due attention to other scholars and especially to Italica Press for providing not the kindling, but the firewood to support the Camino for English speakers. In 1985, Syracuse University art historian William Meltzer published the first English translation of the Codex Calixtinus' Book 5, The Pilgrims Guide, setting the Camino as firmly being the Frances, with its 4 starting points in France, Paris, Vézelay, Le Puy, and Arles. 11 years later, Italica Press published Book 2, The Miracles of St. James, along with the opening letter and the Veneranda Dies sermon, which was translated by me, Linda Davidson, and Tom Coffey, a colleague from Creighton University. His primary scholarship is on the life and writings of Bernard Guy and the monastic writers of 13th century France. Nearly 20 years later, the Codex Calixtinus Book 4, The Chronicle of Pseudo-Turpin, was translated in English by Henry Poole. This book ties Charlemagne, the Milky Way, and the legendary Battle of Roncesvalles firmly to Camino lore. Finally, realizing that they were only 2 books short of the whole set, Eileen Gardner and Ron Musto, owners and editors of Italica Press, agreed to publish Tom Coffey's and my English translations of Books 3, the Translatio of St. James, along with an updated translation of Book 2, Miracles. Linda Davidson, our co-author in the first Miracles, gave her blessing to the new edition of the Miracles, but due to illness was unable to collaborate on the volume. She died in October of 2017. These translations of Book 2 and 3 were quickly followed by Book 1, the Sermons and Liturgy of St. James, along with all the addendum material at the end of the manuscript. As we talk about the Camino Spirit, a little story about this, Jean McCullough, who has been a wonderful, wonderful contributor to the American Pilgrims, many of you know him, tragically was killed in a bike car accident in September. But I always loved Jean. I would count on seeing him first, and he would always be very proud. He'd say, you know, Maryjane, I am the only person I believe in the world that has read your bibliography from cover to cover. And I would believe it. He would always ask me, okay, now, are you sure you have this included? It was wonderful. He would always come up with wonderful questions to try and find out more. He was so interested in things. And so when we started doing the sermons, he was asking some questions. And so I sent it off to him. I said, you know, we're doing the English translation, and would you please read it? So he read the first 100 pages or so, gave me wonderful suggestions about what needed to be included or left out or changed to meet a lay audience, not just a scholarly audience. And so unbeknownst to him, you know, I put him in our thank yous and said, oh, thank you so much for all your help, you know. I sent a copy of the book to him as soon as it came out in February, March-ish. And got a email back from me. He said, oh, thanks for sending me a copy. And about 6 hours later, I get another email, and it says, oh my God, you put my name in here. So he was a very self-effacing man, and I miss him dearly, and it was really sad to come. So 3 losses, you know, for me, Linda and David, and then Jean has been very important. And I just want to bring that back again, this kind of collective memory. So, all English-speaking pilgrims owe a debt of gratitude to Italica Press, whose translations of the entire Codex Calixtinus are high quality, well edited, available on Kindle, and they're extremely affordable. So now you know where you can find the basis of the Camino spirit after the 12th century, the spirit of the pilgrimage as told by the books of the Codex Calixtinus. But what inspired the Codex Calixtinus? How far before the 12th century must we go to find the kindling that led to its creation? We must go all the way back to the 1st century of the Common Era. Amazingly, to me anyway, you will find that there are many pilgrims who don't know the basic history of why or who of the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, or even that Santiago is Spanish for St. James. James the Greater, or James the Elder, Santiago el Mayor, was the 3rd apostle called by Christ to be one of his original 12 disciples. His calling, along with that of his brother John, from whom he is never mentioned apart in the Bible until the story of his martyrdom, came immediately following Jesus' call to Peter and his brother Andrew. Peter, James, and John were the big 3 of the disciples, witnessing each critical event in the life of Jesus. We also know that James and John were named sons of Zebedee in reference to their father, and that Jesus gave them the sobriquet Boanerges, or sons of thunder. This term has a very complicated linguistic history, but most today take it to mean that the brothers had a fiery temper as they asked Jesus if he would like them to call down fire on a Samaritan village that did not welcome them. We also hear of 2 versions of a story about their desire to sit at the right and left hand of Jesus in heaven. One which they asked for themselves, and a second when their helicopter mom, Mary Salome, asked for them, but she's also rebuked. Can you drink this cup? This is what we know about James from the Gospels. But what happened to James after the crucifixion of Jesus? If James were to have traveled to Iberia, let alone Galicia, it would have to have happened after the crucifixion and after Pentecost. But before his beheading in 44 CE in Jerusalem. Notice there is no biblical implication that James traveled or preached on the Iberian Peninsula. But no matter. At some point, he returned to Jerusalem, where we learn of his fate in Acts 12, verses 1 through 2, where it tells us that James was the first of the apostles to be martyred at the direction of Herod the Great. According to legend, the Cathedral of St. James in the Armenian quarter of the old city of Jerusalem was built in the 12th century over the exact spot where James was beheaded. And according to some, his head is still there as a relic. We are not ready to talk about how James came to be buried, with or without his head, in Compostela yet. But before going any farther, I should mention that there is a confusion very early on between the various Jameses in the New Testament. Our James the Greater is not James the Lesser, James the Just, James the brother of Jesus, James the first bishop of Jerusalem, James son of Alphaeus. Again, at no time, we have no time to delve into who each of these people are, but just know that our Santiago, James the Greater, did not write the biblical epistle or letter of St. James. Although the medieval people got it confused too. So St. Bede, first sermon out of the box, ascribes the epistle to Santiago the Mayor, but he was wrong. So don't feel bad if you've been confused about that for forever. So what do we know about James's life between the years 33 and 44? Where did James spend his time during the decade between Pentecost and his death? When and why did Santiago travel to Spain? Or technically speaking, we should talk about traveling to Iberia or Hispania. The early writings of the Eastern churches do not place James in Spain. They do tell us several miracles he performed and of his teaching to both Jews and Gentiles, and they say that he traveled with Peter. The evidence that we have of James preaching, let alone being buried in Compostela, is sketchy and relatively late. Our earliest reference to his post-Pentecostal activities comes via Eusebius' Ecclesiastical history of the 4th century. This is generally considered the earliest extra-biblical description of James that we have, as Eusebius quotes Clement of Alexandria from a century prior, who says, "At that time, namely in the reign of Claudius Augustus, Herod the king set out to afflict some from the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. Concerning this James," now Eusebius is talking, so concerning this James, Clement directly relates something worthy of memory in the 7th book of the Outlines, just as he had received it from great men. For Clement says, "The one who brought James to trial, when he also saw James, confessed the faith of Christ freely, and affirmed that he was also a Christian, having been moved by the perseverance of the man, of James. Therefore, both, this guy who brought him to trial and James himself, both were led to death at the same time. And when his companion asked this same James that he be given forgiveness, James, with very little delay, said, 'Peace be with you,' and immediately kissed him. Thus at the same time, both were cut through at the head and perished." Origen then, via Eusebius, plants the seed of James's power to convert, a story which will grow and flourish with more and greater details until it plants itself firmly onto the hagiographical tradition of Jacobus de Veragene's golden legend of the 13th century. As a later but pre-Veragene example, here we see the story in what is essentially a picture Bible. Eusebius' guard has become a scribe named Josias, who works for Hermogenes, whom James baptized before he is baptized before they are beheaded together. By tradition, this event took place in Jerusalem, and Josias' conversion has, by the 12th century, been added as a detail to the biblical story. The narrative does not connect James either with preaching in Spain or with his body being moved there after his death. But this is a story that is told in the Codex Calixtinus in Book 3 in the Translatio. It is not, however, until the beginning of the 6th century that there are a half-dozen writings that slowly move us closer to Compostela and the Codex Calixtinus' story of James's importance in Hispania. Beginning with the earliest reference from an anonymous Breviary of the Apostles of the 6th century. This work is based on earlier Byzantine or Eastern sources and is much embellished. Tells the whereabouts of all the apostles and their missionary assignments. For example, Peter and Paul were at Rome, Philip was in Gaul, Matthew was in Macedonia, etc. And this is the first to assign Spain to St. James. It exists in multiple manuscripts and was included in various martyrologies. So martyrologies are simply catalogs or lists of martyrs, usually listed by their anniversaries or feast days. And it says, James, whose name means supplanter, son of Zebedee, and brother of John, went to the western parts of Spain and preached, and after being killed with a sword by Herod, was buried and has rested in the Achaia Marmarica, 8th calends of August. This early breviary was the source for Isidore of Seville's, well, it's ascribed to him anyway, De Ortu et Obitum Patrum, on the birth and death of the fathers. This is the first reference written on the Iberian Peninsula to link James to Spain. It is very similar to the previous breviary. James, son of Zebedee, brother of John, the fourth in order, wrote to the 12 tribes that are in the dispersion of the peoples, and he preached the gospel and spread the light of preaching to the peoples of Spain and of the places of the west. By order of Herod, he was killed, and he has lain in repose and buried intra Marmarica. You may notice on the previous slide the blue words Achaia Marmarica, and here intra Marmaricum. It is also at various times written Arca Marmarica. This phrase or these phrases are variously spelled and or interpreted in multiple manuscripts. Earlier scholars have argued that Achaia was a place, that Arca was a tomb, that intra meant inside. By the time of the Codex Calixtinus, these words become parvam, arquatam domum, or small arched house, and they lose any reference to marble. Next on the list of early documents is the Song on the Altars of the 12 Apostles. This hymn is ascribed in a similar time frame as the previous breviary of St. Isidore. Its author was Aldhelm of Malmesbury, he was from the Kingdom of Wessex, on the Isles, right? And he also based his song on the earlier breviaries, but he adds details of James' conversion of the Spanish people before his death and heavenly reward. So he does talk about, he converted the Spanish people with doctrine, the barbaric multitudes that had before revered primitive rites and ghastly temples, as they had been entrapped by the deception of a horrible demon. So he goes on to talk about how Herod did kill him, but the highest Father, who with justice celebrates the saints, transported him with gleaming rewards into the heavenly heights. Where's the body? It doesn't say. Does this mean that James's body was known to be buried on the peninsula, or that he had preached in Galicia or Iberia? Some will argue yes. But there was a lot going on in the religio-political world at this time, and so this is only inferred and is not conclusive. The fourth document, the lengthy hymn O Dei Verbum, O Word of God, is often ascribed to Beatus of de Liébana, and served as part of the Mozarabic liturgy of the Iberian and Hispanic Church of the 7th to 11th centuries. So another little aside, I'm full of them. The term Mozarabic is a little bit misleading. It refers to the Christian rites and liturgy as it had developed and was continuing to develop on the Iberian Peninsula under the Visigothic kings prior to the Moorish invasion, and then later continued by communities of Christians living in territory controlled by Muslims who were known as Mozarabs. And a little bit of background about Christianity in Hispania to begin with. There are allusions to Christianity practiced on the Iberian Peninsula as early as the 2nd century. By the 4th century, it was well established, but the Gnostic heresy, an ascetic belief in dualism, the separation of the kingdom of light and darkness, in which salvation could only be earned through separation from matter, gained ground, and led us to Priscillian of Avila, who became its most vocal supporter. Priscillian was executed in around 380, but this did not quell the cult. When the Visigoths, Vandals, and Sueves swept into the Iberian Peninsula in the mid-5th century, they brought with them another heretical Christianity belief, and that was of Arianism. Arianism maintained that the Son of God was created by the Father and was therefore neither co-eternal with Father God nor consubstantial, was not equal to God. Problems with the Trinity there. Belief in this form of Christianity lasted on the Iberian Peninsula until King Recared renounced it in 589 and converted to what is now known as Roman Catholicism, and thus beginning the development of the Mozarabic rite on the Iberian Peninsula. Beginning around 1080, there was a push by Pope Gregory VII to regularize this Iberian or Mozarabic ritual to match the Roman Catholic liturgy. The Codex Calixtinus, Book 1, the Sermons and Liturgy, shows a melding of the two rites, with liturgy and sermons for both of St. James' feast days. His calling and Translatio of December 30th, which was the primary saint's day for the Mozarabic ritual. So the Mozarabics would have had December 30th be our St. James' Day. But the Codex Calixtinus Book 1 also talks about the preferred Roman date, which is July 25th, which celebrates his passion or his death. So for example, the most famous of all the sermons, number 17, the Veneranda Dies sermon, is actually a feast for the James's calling and Translatio that would have been said on December 30th, not on July 25th. But back to the Ode Verbum. In this 12-verse hymn, strophes 1 through 6 list all the apostles, their mission fields, and equates each one of them to 12 precious stones. But strophes 7 through 10 focus specifically on St. James, linking him more tightly to the Spanish peninsula. Some scholars believe that this hymn indicates a nascent cult of St. James as protector and patron in Hispania, as he has claimed its golden head and its protector and native patron. The last two strophes, numbers 11 and 12, close the hymn referring to Jesus as shepherd and praising God. So, the most curious fact about this hymn, however, and what links it most closely to Spain and the kindling of the Camino spirit, is the acrostic, or a phrase created by the initial letters of each line. Judging by the acrostic, this hymn was written in honor of King Maryjane of Asturias, who reigned from 783 to 88 and died in 789. So what does this have to do with the kindling of the Camino spirit, you might ask? As a Christian king, Maryjane is believed to have defended the church from yet another heresy, that of adoptionism, a non-Trinitarian belief in which Christ is viewed as fully man, adopted by God via baptism as his son. But more importantly to our story of St. James is the fact that King Maryjane is also known as Maryjane the Usurper, as he was the illegitimate son of Alfonso I. He challenged the reign of Alfonso II, the Chaste, the king who would ultimately proclaim the glory of the rediscovery of St. James' tomb. In other words, Maryjane is a contemporary and a rival of the king who is credited with the beginnings of St. James, with the beginnings of the discovery of St. James' tomb. Is this then the first spark to kindle the Camino spirit? Although it is implied that James is patron and protector, there is no mention of his tomb or of Compostela in the Ode Verbum. So at last, in the late 9th century, the Parisian Benedictine monk Eusuard wrote a martyrology which provides us with the first link to the Translatio, or the translation of James' body, to Finisterre, the farthest limits, referring to the region of Galicia, and not, I'm sorry to tell you, to a specific point on the map on the coastline. Finisterre was simply another way of referring to Galicia as a region, that farthest western point of land in general, not a point. Finisterre is used in other documents which specifically refer to the Galician region. So the end point of the pilgrimage was in fact the tomb of the apostle in the cathedral, not at the coastline. Although this martyrology specifically mentions his translation, it is already listed under the Roman Catholic liturgical feast day of his Passion, rather than the Mozarabic feast day of the translation of December 30th. So we've now incorporated this into the general European, Western European liturgy as opposed to the Mozarabic. We've taken it away from his December 30th Saints' Day and moved it, the Translatio, to the July 25th. We're going to put everything on one day. So we've connected James with the Roman Catholic liturgy rather than just the Mozarabic, demonstrating a universality of belief. It gives us notice of an incipient cult to Santiago within the Galician region. And you may have noticed that by the time of Usuard's martyrology, we are well past the date of 813 or 814 or 820 or 823, generally given for the rediscovery of James's tomb by the hermit Pelagius, witnessed by Bishop Theodomir, and confirmed by Alfonso II. Another famous martyrology, written just a bit later by Notker Balbulus, Notker the Stutterer, a Benedictine monk from Switzerland, again provides his feast day as July 25th and connects his death to the biblical book of Acts. But more importantly, he then fills in the rest of James's biography as the apostle who brought Christianity to Spain, preaching to the Spanish peoples, working miracles there, and whose bones were transferred to Finisterre, or what is now Galicia, and the veneration, perhaps of pilgrims or perhaps just of locals, at his tombs. So we have the sacred bones of this holy apostle who were transferred to the Spains, because, you know, there was no one Spain until the Catholic kings, 1492-ish, right? There was the kingdom of Asturias, Galicia, etc. So the sacred bones were transferred to the Spains and buried in their farthest limits, namely near the British Sea. His corporeal presence and teaching and the efficacy of his miraculous works, these same peoples were converted and brought to the faith of Christ. Still, we do not have details of either the Translatio itself and those delightfully detailed tales of boats and miraculous travels, an evil queen, a dragon, and wild bulls, until perhaps the 9th, maybe the 10th century, with the diffusion of the letter of Pope St. Leo, that gives many details of the circumstances of St. James' martyrdom and translation, the actions of his apostles, or his disciples, and the miraculous episodes occurring in search for a place in which to bury his body. These are all collected and made known in this letter. So who was Pope St. Leo? Like the multiple Jameses, there are multiple Pope Leos who were or could be associated with St. James. Pope Leo III, 795 to 816, is more or less contemporary to the discovery of the remains in the tomb and was the Pope who crowned Charlemagne as emperor. But there's also a Pope Leo I, the Great, 440 to 461, who became a doctor of the church, known for his theological writings. There's also a Pope Leo II, who was only Pope for 1 year, from 682 to 683, but who was instrumental in maintaining good relations with the Eastern emperors and in having many of the acts of the Sixth Council of Constantinople translated from Greek to Latin so they could be read and understood by the Western clergy. Doesn't matter. It's unlikely that any of these three had any actual importance in writing this letter. But it's always good to put a famous name, right? There are many, many manuscripts which narrate these details. There are 6 major manuscripts listed and translated into Spanish by Manuel Diaz in his study about the letter. Diaz suggests that the letter has 2 versions, an older one with few embellishments and a less formal, more oral style, which would make sense, and a later version which adds elements and shows a more literary narrative influence. The letter of Pope St. Leo is where we get the stories of Doña or Queen Lupa, who refuses the disciples' request of a place to bury James, sending them up Mount Ilicinus, or the Pico Sacro, where they encounter the wild bulls who became tame and pull the cart with James's body, and the donation of the pagan temple, and finally his burial on Maryjane, the mountain on which Compostela Cathedral is located. It tells of the first church built there, the aforementioned Arca Marmarica, and of the faithful disciples who stayed with the body and preached. The importance of this text cannot be overstated. It's mentioned in another pre-Codex manuscript, the Agreement of Ante Altares, which we'll examine in a few minutes. More importantly, this letter is included as chapter 2 of the Book 3 Translatio story of the Codex Calixtinus. The letter of Pope St. Leo, as it appears in the Codex, is where we get the story of James's disciple Josias, the guard or scribe who was converted and seen with James in the earlier picture Bible. The divine help received by James's disciples in getting his body to Joppa and securing about, the transportation of James' body by sea to the port of Iria, where they find a pagan temple of Maryjane, the mountain on which Compostela is located and converted into a small church, and of the faithful disciples who stayed there and preached, Theodorus and Athanasius. The Codex offers up other elements in separate chapters of the Translatio, such as the dragon and the wild bulls, but not in its specific version of the letter in chapter 2. So the letter that we have in the Codex is later highly embellished, and not one of these original, but it takes a lot of those famous stories and includes them. These other events and stories and people who appear in the Codex Calixtinus Translatio story are based not on this letter, but on other narratives, especially what's called the Passionario Hispanico from before the 11th century. A passionary is a compilation of narratives that recount the life, martyrdom, translation, and/or miracles of saints. The entry for St. James in the Passionario Hispanico weaves together various elements from the Eastern tradition, the story of Hermogenes and Josias again, for example, and brings them to the Iberian Peninsula, but it says nothing about James preaching in Spain, having disciples in Spain, or the translation and the burial of the body. So why is it so important? Well, the Passionario Hispanico is essential for kindling the Camino as it melds St. James's story with a local saint, Sant Torquato of Guadix, which in turn introduces us by name to the 7 men who were with him, the Siete Varones Apostolicos, who in later manuscripts are designated as disciples of Jesus, not of Sant Torquato. Of these, the most important story, the Passionario tells several miracles that happened to San Torquato, but of these, the most important is that of a bridge which collapses under the pursuers of St. Torquatus and his companions, an act which is witnessed by a noble woman, who was not at that point a Christian, named Luparia, there we get the name, interestingly enough, who then converts to Christianity. So all of the documents and references mentioned to this point, and yet we still don't have any written proof as to who kindled the Camino spirit. How and when and by whom was St. James's tomb discovered, thus sparking the international pilgrimage phenomenon? The earliest narrative of the discovery or rediscovery of the tomb of St. James is actually included in a 1077 land agreement between the Church of Santiago and the monastery of San Pedro ante Altares. The oldest extant copy of this agreement is from 1434. Many pilgrims are shocked to learn that the story of the discovery of the tomb by the hermit Mccullough in circa 813, 814, 820, whatever date you want to give there, is not told in the Codex Calixtinus. The agreement of Ante Altares was written due to Alfonso VI's desire to expand the size of the church. we can see here the position of the tomb and crypt in the early Church of Santiago in relation to the Benedictine monastery of Ante Altares. Here's our church, right? Here's the cathedral. Here's the little passageway, and here's the monastery. So this is the disputed area right here. Here's the tomb where we would go down and see the ark, right? And then here's Ante Altares, their connection to their monastery. This agreement was necessary so that Alfonso VI could expand the Church of St. James beyond its original altar area, its new chapels encroaching on the worship area of the monks, precluding them from celebrating Mass at the altars which they had created. And so an agreement was reached to allow the monks the space and the monetary receipts of certain other altars within the cathedral. And so the result is what we see here is that eventually, it's totally taken down. So this is our church, and they get the receipts from certain chapels, but they had originally gotten the receipts from this chapel. So it was really a land deal. It was an important deal. So the preface to all this legalese was the story that most of us have heard about the finding of the tomb and the founding of the church. It was in the times of the most serene King and Lord Alfonso, who was called the Chaste, that would be Alfonso II. It was first revealed through angelic announcements to a certain hermit by the name of Pelagius, who was accustomed to spend time not far away from the place where the apostolic body lay. Then by many heavenly lights, notice it does not say stars, by heavenly lights it was disclosed to the faithful residing in the parish of San Fis de Solovio. Campo, does not lift to O, compo, stela, the double L of stellae in Latin, which remains as a double L with the Y sound in estrella, or in the Navarrese pueblo of Estella, but double L does not ever drop to a single L, stela. The language of the legends of discovery do not support this popular belief also, as none of the early stories mention stars. They talk about lights. And there was a word for star, but they didn't use star. They used lights. As you look at the archaeological plan over which the cathedral is built, you can see the many tombs underneath and around it. This was the original Roman castro or village's burial area. So one possible etymology suggests the Latin compositum, or the local vulgar Latin composita tela, meaning burial ground. There are some who say that Compostela simply comes from Latin compositela, meaning well composed or something that's beautifully arranged. Personally, I opt for the more obvious burial ground. So I'm sorry to burst your bubble about this lovely but false image. It's sort of like the stone boat that I talked about 3 years ago here. There was no stone boat. But what you might ask about the association of the Camino with the Via Láctea, the Ruta de Estrellas, the starry path. I promised earlier in this presentation to come back briefly to Book 4, the Chronicle of Pseudo-Turpin. The association between the stars of the Milky Way and the Camino de Santiago has a bit more veracity and historical basis, since in the Chronicle of Turpin, Charlemagne contemplates the night sky and sees a path of stars, a caminum stellarum. And although he describes it as beginning in the Frisian Sea and extending through Germany and Italy and Gaul and Aquitaine and passing directly over Gascony, Vasconia, Navarre, and Spain to Galicia, where the body of St. James lay buried and undiscovered. In other words, the Milky Way kind of covered all of Europe with a lot of twists and turns. If it was plotted on a map, it would run more or less all over the place and not directly across northern Spain as the Milky Way does in the summer months. So I'm sorry, I hope this doesn't rain on your Camino kindling and dampen your Camino spirit, but if it does, let's close on the sunny side. As we continue this weekend thinking about rekindling the Camino spirit, let me suggest that we go back to the early lessons of the shell from the Codex Calixtinus, the ubiquitous shell that originally served as a badge of completion, not of initiation. The shell that represents the lesson that all pilgrims should learn, that the spirit of pilgrimage is that of charity, to love God and to love one's neighbor as oneself, and that we show that love through good works on the journey of this present life. On the Camino, through your good works, may you be the kindling and spark of the Camino spirit for others, and in doing so, may you carry your own light forward. Ultreya and Susea, everybody.